Since I was a member of online international musician communities, I have encountered a number of confusion about brass instruments and brass music from outside of the English-speaking world, specifically of the region of Central and Eastern Europe. Now that I have been a member of these communities for some time, I have a general idea of what the standpoint of an average musician from beyond the sea is to this topic, and know some of the most common points of confusion. I have therefore deemed myself qualified to do a breakdown of Central and Eastern European traditional brass music and common brass instruments in use. Before we start, a couple of disclaimers. At the end of the video, I will explore some interesting facts or points of confusion about some of these instruments or the music. If you are here to hear about a specific instrument, do not leave right after me talking about it. You might learn even more about it later. For me, the word horn is not simply synonymous with a wind instrument, but refers specifically to the instrument you might be tempted to call a French horn. I will later explain why this name is not entirely correct. Please keep this in mind while watching this video to avoid confusion. This video is for education and entertainment purposes only. I do not mean to offend anyone or to spark any conflicts. If there is anything in the video you find offending or insulting, please know it was not the intention, and let's have a friendly conversation about it. As a template for this video, I will use the traditional Czech brass band form. This form exists and is similar or the same in Germany, Austria, and many Slavic countries, and includes all the brass instruments in common use in this geography, even outside of this genre. For the rest of this video, I will be referring to this form of band simply as the brass band. Please do not confuse this with the British brass band, since that is something quite different, and one of the points of this video is to point out the differences between the two. When mentioning the British brass band, I will always specify that I am talking about the British brass band. Let me start with a brief overview of the sections in the traditional brass band, each of which will be explored in more detail later. The brass band is typically divided into two main parts, both of which are divided further. These two are the front row, also known as the melodic section, and the back row, also known as the harmonic, the rhythmic, or the accompaniment section. First off, let me briefly get through the few instruments of the brass band that are not brass instruments themselves, not because they would be unimportant, but simply because they are not the main focus of this video. The woodwinds is a subsection of the melodic section. It typically consists of 2 or 3 B-flat clarinets and 1 E-flat clarinet, sometimes doubled by a C flute. Their role is to be an ornament of the band. Their brass band repertoire consists mostly of trills and short, quick decorational runs that complement the main melody, though they occasionally get to play the lead voice as well. The percussion housed in the accompaniment section can be a variety of instruments that slightly varies depending on repertoire and situation. Typically, it includes the reduced drum set when playing on one place, or a battery when marching, consisting of the snare drum, the bass drum, and the cymbals. More instruments can be included depending on specific needs or availabilities of the ensemble. I believe an explanation of this section's purpose to be unnecessary, since the role of percussion is pretty much the same all around the world and genres. It is important to note that traditional brass bands do not typically include pitched percussion. Now, let's get into the brass instruments, and what better place to start than with the staple of the genre. This instrument here is the flugelhorn. It is a large bore instrument with a conical tubing in the key of soprano B flat and it reads a B-flat transposed treble clef notation. It is the icon of the traditional brass band as well as its main lead instrument. These have the role of the French trumpets or the British cornets, meaning they have the largest percentage of main melodies and lead parts in their repertoire. This is the instrument you listen to when you listen to the brass music. There are typically two parts for flugelhorns in the brass band, with an occasional third part substituting the part of an alt horn. The flugelhorn, as we know it today, originates in the region of Bohemia or the modern Czech Republic. It is spread around and popular in most of the Central and Eastern Europe. An adaptation of flugelhorn with piston valves exists and is popular in the Western countries. However, its role is not nearly as substantial as the one of Central European flugelhorns. This is the alt horn. It is an alto-pitched, large-bore instrument with a conical tubing. It plays in the key of E flat, and it reads a transposed treble clef notation. Alt horn is a little bit of the odd one out in the melodic section of the brass band. They sit in between the section of flugelhorns and the section of tenor horns and baritones. Their role is to double, supplement, or expand the parts of the two earlier mentioned. There is typically one or no part for the alt horn in the brass band, and it is after the flute the instrument not often entirely missing from the melodic section of the less populated, dedicated, or financially founded bands. This next instrument is the baritone, and in the picture on the screen you can see a tenor horn. They are very similar to each other. They both have the same length of tubing and play in the key of tenor B flat. The telling difference between the two are the bore size and how much conical their tubing is. Also, the way their music is written is different. The tenor horn, for its smaller dimensions, has a brighter and clearer sound, even though it still is quite warm. It typically reads music in B-flat transposed treble clef. It is the more common of the two. The baritone, with its larger proportions, has a warmer and rounder sound. It reads music in concert pitch bass clef. These two instruments, despite their slight differences, are one section. There is typically one part for each of them, and they typically play together. They work as the secondary main lead instrument after flugelhorns. They get many counter melodies and sometimes enforce or double the bass. Most importantly, however, they have the second largest proportion of the lead parts, only surpassed by flugelhorns. It often happens that these and flugelhorns simply take turns in playing the lead for the entirety of the song. It might look like I am skipping ahead a little, but for the sake of the next point, it makes sense to talk about basses at this point rather than later. There are typically two parts for the bass in the brass band, usually simply called bass 1 and bass 2. They both read music in concert pitch bass clef. They are typically supposed to be covered by the bass F tuba and the contrabass B flat tuba. They are both conical, large bore instruments as well and live in the accompaniment section of the ensemble. Their most important and quite obvious role is the bass, yet they sometimes double or octave the melody of tenor horns, baritones and trombones. Tuba, in its most modern form, originates in the region of Bohemia and is arguably the most substantial contribution of this culture to the brass music of the entire world. It is the only instrument of this origin to have found its way into the standard cast of the symphonic orchestra. It has also been adopted and adapted around the globe and is an inherent part of the vast majority of brass music worldwide. When marching, a concert tuba can get quite unergonomic and uncomfortable. Bass players therefore often opt to rather play a helicon when marching, or playing standing up. Both bass F and contrabass B-flat versions of helicon exists and are in use today. Helicons originate in the Austria-Hungary as well. There is no difference between these and concert tubas other than the thickest pipes being behind the player's back for a better balance and ease of carrying it around. This instrument, as you may suspect, was the inspiration and the base model for the American sousaphones. All the brass instruments we have talked about so far are members of one instrument family, the flugelhorns. First models of all of them were first developed by Václav František Červený in Hradec Králové, located in modern-day Czech Republic, and became the staple of the local music of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well as all the successor countries. The soft and mellow timbre of the large-bore conical instruments was easily distinguishable and recognizable. They later spread throughout the Central and the Eastern Europe. They were being developed at about the same time as when the Belgian designer Adolphe Sax was developing his sax horns family of instruments, popular in today France, Britain, and the United States of America. These two families are almost mirrors of each other, yet sax horns have smaller bore size and are much more cylindrical, meaning they have skinnier tubing. This made the families have so very different timbre. Many of Červeny's designs, including the flugelhorn or the tubas, were being adopted and adapted by other nations, which is an undeniable proof of their qualities. Červený is also responsible for the development of modern rotary valves. This is one of the reasons why pretty much all his designs, as well as most other instruments made and used in the region, use this type of valves. Václav František Červený is a very important name in the development of modern brass, and it is also a brand of high-quality instruments up to this day. I highly encourage you to research more about them. If I do not forget, I will put the link to their website into the description of this video. I should probably emphasize more that we are talking about development and developers of the modern variants of the instruments that exists and are being produced and regularly used in almost unchanged likeness until today. If we wanted to go further into history, we would, for example, find out that the first instrument in history known as tuba was the one of Wilhelm Moritz, and it looked like this. It was a bass instrument and did not have a contrabass variant, and it used a type and configuration of valves unique to Germany, which Germans later abandoned in favor of the modern rotary valves and the bohemian designs of Mr. Červený. All that the flugelhorns is based on a bugle. The first modern flugelhorn is, however, the rotary valved one, and the development of bugles had quite different directions elsewhere in the world. Both of these and more are, however, maybe topics for another video. Other noteworthy instrument family of the Eastern Europe were shediphones. These were double-bell instruments based on Červeny's flugelhorn family designed by a Ukrainian designer Shedivy. They ranged from a soprano trumpet to a contrabass helicon. In their times, they were reasonably popular in Ukraine, Belarus, the Russian Empire, and other countries in the area. They are, however, almost entirely obsolete nowadays. The trumpet is a subsection of the accompaniment section of the brass band. It includes up to 2 soprano-pitched B-flat trumpets, 2 E-flat alto trumpets, and a bass trumpet pitched in tenor B-flat. They are all small-bore cylindrical instruments, which makes their timbre very recognizable among all the large-bore cylindrical instruments. They all read notation in treble clef transposed to their relative keys. Their role is primarily rhythm and harmony. Their repertoire consists of mostly offbeats, rhythmically supporting passages and signals. Counter to the expectation, in the brass band, trumpets get a negligible amount of melody, which is for the most part left to flugelhorns. They are therefore often a neglected and very underrated section. They are, however, the rhythmical backbone of the ensemble. It is also the only section you may hope to see a piston-valved instrument in, though, depending on the specific geography, in a more professional setting, it is mostly a rarity. This B-flat trumpet is commonly known here as the concert trumpet, as opposed to the piston-valved variant known as the jazz trumpet. These nicknames imply the situations each one is used in more often. The concert trumpet is the standard to be used in symphonic or chamber orchestras and the traditional music. The jazz trumpet is mostly popular in genres originating on the West. The horns are found in the accompaniment section of the brass band. They are an alto instrument pitched in F and read F transpose treble clef notation. Some of you may know that horns are unique in the world of brass in that their tubing is twice as long relative to their notes than most other brass instruments. This influences the way a player thinks of harmonics and makes playing it a distinct experience. Typically, there are 2 to 4 horns in a brass band accompaniment section. Their role is somewhat fluid between being an extension and an enforcement of the trumpet's rhythmic role, and being an extension and enforcement of the melody of flugelhorns or tenor horns. Some smaller cast bands only have one of the tenor horn or baritone in the standard role of a baritone, while replacing the tenor horn in its role with a horn. The horn has an important role in the symphonic orchestras, essentially being the lead brass instrument, and it is also popular in other genres. Trombones are members of the accompaniment section of the brass band. There are typically 2 or 3 B-flat tenor trombones, with a third one sometimes being a bass trombone. They are cylindrical instruments and they read a concert-pitched bass clef notation. Their role is similar to the one of horns in that they are fluid between being a rhythmic and harmonic support and being a melody double or extension. They of course gravitate more towards the tenor horns and baritones, and quite often they also double one of the basses. To accommodate preferences of some players, some trombones used in the area use rotary valves instead of the regular slide. They are, however, similarly as popular as piston-valved trombones on the West. Trombone is an inherent part of the symphonic orchestra as well as many other genres originating both in and out of the region. I have mentioned a few times already why it is that all the valved instruments featured in this video have rotary valves. This is simply because the rotary valves are a tradition in the region. It is similar as to why in British brass band everything has pistons, and this is pretty much the only type of valves the Brits ever use. The modern rotary valves were developed by Václav František Červený on the territory of the modern Czech Republic, as was said earlier. Sometimes musicians make use a piston-valved variant of the instrument as a sort of a curiosity, but that is more of an exception than a rule. The instruments which people will use piston valves with most often, and really the only brass instruments I have ever seen with the piston valves, are trumpets. But that is still quite rare in professional settings. Never have I seen a piston-valved tuba or almost any other piston-valved instruments in person, since they are simply not very common in the region. It is, however, interesting that piston-valved trumpets are very popular with music schools. A B-flat trumpet is the instrument that almost exclusively all brass players start with. Piston-valved trumpet, even though not as quick, technical and precise as a rotary valve ones, are more durable against abuse and are therefore a less risky and more optimal choice of an instrument to give to a child. The cheaper ones also start on a fraction of the price. I might also say that in Austria, Vienna valves are fairly popular. This is an English nomenclature for the instruments of the saxhorn family. The flugelhorn family, even though similar in many ways, are historically and practically unrelated family of instruments, and their names therefore work differently and independently of the names of the saxhorns. A few times I have encountered online a euphonium player complaining about euphonium not being part of the symphonic orchestra and later bringing up the Mahler symphony as an example of exception. If there is a classical piece that includes a euphonium and the author of the piece is from Germany, Austria or some Slavic country, there is a high chance that rather than a euphonium, either a tenor horn or a baritone was the original instrument intended for the part. These are also the instruments that we use to play euphonium parts in music originating in the English-speaking countries. Just like you have never heard of these instruments ever before, most local people haven't got any slightest clue of what a euphonium is, myself included, for a very long time. And even after studying these foreign, exotic instruments for quite some time, I have only ever seen euphoniums on pictures and in videos. Aren't baritones simply euphoniums? The short answer is no, they are not. But there is a very interesting history behind this. As we already know, Czerweny was the original developer of the baritone and based his first tuba designs on it. The British bands included no large bore conical instruments until the day when they adopted the tubas and flugelhorn, rearranged their tubing and gave them piston valves to be visually more similar to the saxhorns they were already used to. They did not adopt the conical baritones, however. Later, Brits developed multiple pitched tubas, among them the E-flat tuba, even today very popular in Britain, and the tenor tuba in B-flat. This tenor tuba later experienced minor changes in design and started being called the euphonium. The British have thus sort of reverse developed an instrument in its properties very similar to the flugelhorn baritone, yet very distantly related to it. I will just repeat once again that I, as well as most people in the Central or Eastern Europe, have never seen a euphonium in person a single time in their lives. F tuba, not an E-flat tuba? An F tuba indeed. Often have I heard an American person say, E-flat tubas are the popular type in Europe. Let me correct this statement. E-flat tubas are the popular type in Britain. I do, however, realize that many people in the world's greatest country regard the Great Britain to be the entirety of Europe. It is therefore an understandable mistake. You may have noticed that a few of the instruments of the flugelhorn family showcased in this video are straight, and some have the shape of 6. Well, original models of all these instruments indeed had the straight design. When helicons came around, it inspired the designers to develop the 6-shaped models that would be more visually complementary to helicons. You might therefore think of them as the marching variants of the instruments. This is also the reason why you never see a 6-shaped tuba. As the time went by, the 6-shaped models became the standard even outside of the setting of marches. That being said, the straight variants of the instruments are still being produced and are just not as common as the six-shaped models. An interesting thing to point out is that even though you might be tempted to call it a French horn, it is in fact not French. At the times chromatic brass was being developed, the favorite types of valves of the French were pistons, since it was an invention of Mr. Perrinet, who was a French citizen. At the time, they have included pistons on their horns as well. Vast majority of today horns use rotary valves, which, as we have earlier clarified, were developed in the region of Bohemia by the designer Mr. Czerweny. And even though I have no solid materials to confirm the origin of the first horn using rotary valves, I believe it is safe to assume it originates in this area as well. My personal theory as to why it is called a French horn in English is that to the place where the English language has evolved for the most part, the Great Britain, most commodities imported from the continental Europe had to travel through France, their nearest country on the continent. Therefore, anything coming from the continental Europe was allegedly coming from France and was therefore French. I came to understand that the word Germany in most dialects of the American English simply means the Central Europe. Who could possibly be bothered to distinguish between all these small unimportant countries, right? The way I see it, referring to my culture as German is about as insulting as it is asking a Spanish person where have they learned to speak Mexican so well, or to say to an American that they are just another British colony. This music originates in the former Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the most prominent people in its development were Czechs, Slovaks, and occasionally Austrians. The style of music is indeed played in Germany as well, and it is fairly popular there, but it does not originate in Germany. I would appreciate the cultural legacy of my country to be recognized. I am glad to have resolved this misunderstanding once and for all, and I believe I will never have to hear the term German-style baritone ever again. Thank you all very much for watching this video. Feel free to fact-check me in the comments or in any form of a message. I am just a human and I may have missed or misinterpreted something. Please let me know if you have any questions. I will try and answer all of them. Also, if you would like to hear about a different topic in the future, if I am qualified, I am happy to make another one of these educational videos.